Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. This is Reincarnation and Resistance, the rest of the Norse pantheon. So this is sort of a supplemental lecture to our one on Odin. God of War and Assassin's Creed Valhalla also make use of other Norse gods, so we're going to do a bit of a survey. And look at a little bit about how some of those mythical characters are incorporated into the game's storyline, as well as how they compare to their original versions. So I want to start with probably the most important, in terms of narrative importance, god in either of these games who's not Odin, and that is Baldr from God of War. So in myth, the god Baldr is a relatively passive figure. All he does is die, basically. He's pretty, he's beloved, and he dies. The foreshadowing begins with Baldr's disturbing dreams of his own death. Baldr's mother Frigg proceeds to exact a vow from every object on Earth not to hurt her son, except the mistletoe plant, and she leaves it alone because she figures it's too young and small to pose a threat. Now, the trickster god Loki, upon discovering this exception, actually manipulates matters to use mistletoe to kill Baldr. While the gods are playing a game by throwing things at Baldr, they're throwing things at him because he's invulnerable. Because Frigg has made him invulnerable to all weapons, all objects, all people, except mistletoe. Loki gives Baldr's brother Hodr, who is blind, a dart of mistletoe. Hodr throws it and slays Baldr, much to the horror of the rest of the family. It's all fun and games until somebody finds the exception to their mother's magic. So another god, Hermod, goes to Hel to try and negotiate Baldr's return, and Hel agrees to allow Baldr to return to the world of the living, thus thwarting Ragnarok, as long as every living thing weeps for him. But a giantess, who may very well be Loki in disguise, refuses to do so, so the attempt to resurrect Baldr fails. Now, Loki is eventually punished for Baldr's death, and it happens to put him where he needs to be to break free and lead the giants against the Aesir in Ragnarok, but we'll get to Loki in a few minutes. So the key problem here is that Baldr's death is a killing within the family again. So something that Scandinavian social structure, with its tendency towards blood feud as a way of resolving disputes, simply could not accommodate. Now, Odin fulfills another prophecy given to him by having a son, Vali, who is foretold to be Baldr's avenger, but this simply displaces the problem of brother killing brother to the next generation. The social order of the gods begins to crumble one way or the other, and this brings on Ragnarok. Now, the Baldr from God of War somehow manages to both deviate from and adhere to this original Baldr. So he's not identified at his first appearance. He's this half-naked man with wild tattoos and a red beard. He shows up at Kratos' home not long after Faye's death, seemingly in search of Kratos. His dialogue is really kind of vague and elliptical. You're not sure what he's talking about. He certainly sounds crazy. He seems to think that Kratos is aware of who he is and what he wants. And when Kratos doesn't play nice, he very quickly turns to violence. Now, during the fight that ensues, he reveals that Odin sent him for answers, and he just laughs off Kratos' blows because he says he can't feel anything. Now, he's clearly unstable, as I said, based on his disjointed outbursts, but he's obviously intelligent enough to notice the two beds in Kratos' home when they go smashing through it in mid-brawl. So the prospect of this madman getting his hands on his son is enough to give Kratos the strength to snap his neck, or so he thinks. He stumbles off, grabs Atreus, and they head for the mountains to scatter Faye's ashes, even though Kratos had just told his son he didn't think he was ready for the trip. At the time, Kratos obviously doesn't know that the stranger is going to recover from a broken neck, but he realizes that the situation is not resolved if the local gods are now taking an interest in him. Now, they eventually discover that the stranger is Baldr. They are, later in the game, trapped in Helheim together, and the two of them overhear Baldr being tormented by the ghosts of his past. Specifically, he sees himself arguing with his mother Freya, who was the one who enchanted him to be invulnerable. The real Baldr is screaming at his ghostly self to kill her, and then dissolves into weeping and self-flagellation about his own cowardice, when past Baldr simply tells his mother he never wants to see her again. This is kind of a fascinating twist on the original myth. I mean, instead of simply asking the various living things and forces of the world to promise not to harm her son, Baldr's mother protects him with her own magic, never foreseeing how damaging the consequences are going to be. He's invulnerable, but that also means he cannot feel anything. He can't touch anything. And it breaks him psychologically, and it destroys his relationship with his mother. So she's trying to save him from his prophesied fate. But Freya, who is otherwise a really sympathetic character, like you like Freya, she helps out Kratos and Atreus. She actually brings his fate about. Now, by the end of the game, they've fought him numerous times at this point, and they're attacked once more when they're on the verge of reaching their destination. Freya tries to intervene, just trying to keep them apart so they won't fight, but Baldr won't listen to him. He even attacks Atreus, so he attacks a child, but he cuts his hand on a piece of mistletoe. And the mistletoe comes from arrows that one of the dwarven smiths had given Atreus. And earlier in the game, Freya had noticed Atreus carrying these arrows and had taken them away from him, saying they were too dangerous. But she hadn't noticed that Kratos had used a piece of the mistletoe to fix a break in, I think it was the strap of Atreus' quiver. So Baldr breaks the magical protection on himself by cutting himself on the little bit of mistletoe. And he's absolutely delighted. You know, he fights Kratos. He's screaming joyfully about being able to feel everything. Kratos is actually willing to let him live. Like, he beats the crap out of him. But Freya's begging him not to kill him. And he's willing not to kill him. But he says, don't come after us again and leave your mother alone. And Baldr refuses. He wants vengeance against his mother. Freya is willing to let him kill her, if that's going to make him feel better. It's just really dysfunctional when you think about it. But Kratos intervenes. He snaps Baldr's neck. And this provokes an absolutely fearsome vow of vengeance from Freya that I think is, from the looks of the trailer for the next God of War, is going to be something they deal with in the game. You know, Kratos is trying to teach his son, you know, that you got to break the cycle of vengeance, but Freya's not willing to forgive and forget. I mean, he may have averted violence within the family, but Baldr's still dead. Ragnarok is still coming, and by the time they scatter, phase ashes and go home, Fimbulwinter, the prophesied long winter, is starting to settle in. And Loki. So Loki in myth is a really unusual figure. We don't even know for sure if he was a god. According to Snorri, he is counted amongst the Aesir. He may not actually be one of them. He's a trickster. He's a friend of Odin and Thor. He goes on adventures with them, but he also fools around with goddesses. He's responsible for the giants stealing treasure, but then sometimes would help get it back. So for instance, when Mjolnir is stolen, he helps retrieve it. He would often create a dangerous situation and then help resolve it. He's an unusual figure, very contradictory. Now, technically he is a giant because his father, Farbauti, was a giant, and in Scandinavian society you reckon kinship along paternal lines. He is the father of 3 notable monsters, the Midgard serpent, the wolf Fenrir, and Hel. His spouse and the mother of these monsters was the giantess or ogress Angrboda. He also has 1 or 2 sons, depending on the source, with his other wife, Sigyn. He is a craftsman, he's a gambler, he's a shape changer, he also changes gender. You know, he's actually the mother of an 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, Odin's mount. He's involved, as we've discussed, in the murder of Baldr, which is his great crime amongst the gods. Because of this, he is captured and bound until the day of Ragnarok, where he and his children take a role as enemies of the gods. He seems to become more evil as the world deteriorates towards the end. Some scholars have said he's actually some type of demon. Others that he's actually Odin, but he's Odin's evil aspect. It's an interesting thought. Now, he is depicted, interestingly, as Odin's blood brother. It's a voluntary connection. Odin swears, for instance, never to drink ale unless Loki has already been offered a drink. This may have been Odin trying to keep him in check. If so, it didn't work very well. So basically, Loki is the enemy of the gods in the mythic past and in the mythic future. But in the mythic present, he's sort of a frenemy, I suppose, is the best way to put it. Now, in terms of the games, in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Loki is one of the reincarnated Isu. In the 9th century, he lives as a member of the Brotherhood, Basim, who accompanies Ivor's brother Sigurd back to Norway from Constantinople. Basim is a high-ranking member of the Hidden Ones, which is the original name for the assassins. And he's very obscure about what he's doing, accompanying Sigurd. Only if you do the Vision quest line do you actually find out that he's Loki. Because Loki looks a little bit like Basim. He has the same voice actor. And in the Vision quest arcs, you get a very traditional depiction of him as a trickster. He's not really trusted by the rest of the Aesir. Havi, or Odin, becomes obsessed with Ragnarok and the figure of the giant wolf from the Vision, and he imprisons Fenrir, not realizing that he's Loki's son, and in doing so, he breaks the oath of blood brotherhood. Even though he doesn't kill Fenrir, he's still acting against Loki's blood, and so Loki holds it against him that he violated his oath and starts plotting. Now, meanwhile, in the actual reality of 9th century England, Basim is, again, a weirdly ambiguous figure at times. He is encouraging Sigurd to explore his belief that he's a god. Sigurd is the reincarnation of Tyr. But he also seems genuinely friendly towards Ivor, despite probably suspecting from the start that he as well is connected to the Isu. He may even have suspected that he was the reincarnation of Odin. He actually teaches Ivor things, so certain stealth techniques, for example. He seems genuinely grateful when Ivor becomes friendly with Basim's student, Hytham. Hytham is wounded in the first mission that they go on together in Norway, sort of relegated to the status of having a desk job afterwards. He helps Ivor on various missions. He even seems to genuinely try and encourage him to reconnect with Sigurd after some of the events of the storyline. But at the end of the game, he attacks Ivor and Sigurd when they return to Norway to investigate Sigurd's visions and find the Yggdrasil vault. And he is weirdly angry and amused at the same time when he figures out that the device in Ivor's neck was damaged by the wolf's bite, which prevented Odin from manifesting fully in Ivor. But all of this is part of a bigger plot that results in him being imprisoned in the Yggdrasil vault and eventually released into the modern day, where he's apparently going to go looking for his ways to resurrect his family and his children. So in a way, he's a post-Ragnarok Loki. He survives Ragnarok and exits into a new world. Now, in God of War, of course, Atreus is Loki. He finds out at the end of the game that that's the name his mother, Faye, who is actually the giantess Laufey the Just, who was the final guardian of her people, gave him at his birth. Atreus is the Spartan name that Kratos wanted to give him instead. Now, the fact that he unintentionally breaks the magic on Baldr with the mistletoe, it's him playing a very similar yet sort of accidental role in Baldr's death. He doesn't kill him himself, but he leaves him vulnerable. So it should be very interesting to see where Atreus Loki goes in the sequel, which most of you, as I said, probably know, but at this point it's called Ragnarok. Alright, other assorted deities. Baldr and Loki are probably the big two outside Odin in God of War and Valhalla, but there are certainly others, Thor being a significant one. So Thor of myth. Thor has power over the natural world. He contests with supernatural adversaries to protect the gods and mankind. He's essentially a protector god. He's much less complex than Odin. His cult was probably a lot more popular than Odin's in some parts of Scandinavia, because he's a much more straightforwardly masculine god. His axe or his hammer represents the power of lightning to fell trees and shatter rocks, and he's often away from Asgard killing giants. Now, in God of War, you see him only in a momentary vision at the end. He's come to confront Kratos and Atreus. You recognize him because he's got Mjolnir at his side. But you get a sense of his character by meeting his sons, Magni and Modi, who help Baldr hunt father and son. And they seem to delight in being casually cruel. So they threaten Mimir that, when no one's looking, we'll be back for your other eye. They go to Atreus with lewd insults about his mother. They torture Kratos. After Magni's killed by Kratos and Modi fails to avenge his death, they later run into him again, and he's mutilated. He says this is what his father did to him for what he deemed to be cowardice. So you get a very negative impression of Thor, even though you don't really meet him. And Magni and Modi have very different ends in the game than they do in Norse mythology. They are actually prophesied to survive Ragnarok and inherit their father's hammer. Now, the image on this slide is an image of Thor from the God of War sequel that has literally just been released. And he is depicted here much more like the Thor of myth. So red-haired and bearded, very big, nothing at all like Chris Hemsworth. So you don't have the Aryan Barbie Superman here. Now, in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, some of the writers have been interviewed and have revealed that there are other reincarnated Isu encountered by Eivor, and Thor, whom Eivor does meet in Asgard in the Vision Quest arc, is apparently reincarnated as Halfdan Ragnarsson, who's a very significant NPC in some of the later game arcs. And Halfdan is one of the sons of Ragnar, winds up as the king of Jorvik. He is basically a big, angry guy with a hammer. Now, we see Freya in both games. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the older of the two seeresses from Eivor's original home in Norway, Svala, is the reincarnation of Freya. You meet her as the mother of the seer who eventually helps Eivor on their vision quests. And when she's dying back in Norway, she makes her way to the Yggdrasil vault and plugs herself into the supercomputer. And she's there in the simulation of Valhalla when Sigurd and Eivor end up there towards the end of the game. You don't really see much of her beyond this, but it does imply that she was in touch with her original incarnation's personality. I mean, she's elderly and a bit mad when you meet her at the beginning of the game, so it's hard to tell what's going on. And of course, Freya, we've already touched on Freya from God of War. She's initially introduced as a woods witch who is friendly towards Kratos and Atreus. She actually helps save Atreus from an illness, but then swears vengeance against Kratos when he kills her son. Alright, so that should give you a sense of how the Norse gods are wound into two of our games and their game worlds. Again, we haven't talked about Skyrim because it doesn't really use the gods. It uses other aspects of Norse myth, especially the story of Ragnarok. Now, what I find most interesting is that none of the depictions of these gods are admirable. Probably the only exception is Tyr in God of War. We don't see Tyr in the first God of War. He is apparently going to appear in the second, where Atreus and Kratos are going to go looking for him. Now, he's the original war god of the Norse pantheon, we think, but he's also associated with wisdom. He's a smart war god, and that's kind of a scary thing. He's sometimes referred to as the Lord of Justice as well. Now, the Isu Tyr is reincarnated as Sigurd in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and Sigurd in the flashbacks in the Vision quests, Tyr in the Vision quest seems to try and want to be more moderate than Havi, but Sigurd is kind of cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, if you want to put it that way, and doesn't really seem all that temperate through most of the game. So all of this, I think, is part of a push to de-romanticize the Norse gods. And this is part of a bit of pushback against some of the misuse of this material in popular culture. I mean, think about this image of Thor from God of War Ragnarok. it's not as easy to hold that up as an aspirational ideal. I saw somebody complaining about it on Twitter where they gave an image of Thor where it was ridiculous. He was also half naked, but he had this ridiculous washboard set of abs, a six-pack or maybe like a 12-pack, and he was blonde and blue-eyed, the perfect Aryan ideal. But this Thor is much closer to the mythology. Now, there's a lot going on here with these games and how they use this material. It's really interesting. There's a lot of thought that goes into it. And I would say God of War in particular, Santa Monica Studios and Cory Bartlog absolutely determined that they are not going to get the same reception as Skyrim. And I'm very interested to see what they do with Ragnarok. Alright, so that should wrap us up for the week. Hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all at the Zoom session. Thanks very much.